Hi, everyone. We'll just give it another 30 seconds or so for a few more people to join the room. All right, I think we have enough to start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this launch of UNEP's Adaptation Gap Report. Before I hand over to the moderator, Musonda Mumba, I'll just give you a few housekeeping notes. My name is Keisha Rukikaire. I'm the head of news and media for UNEP. Now we'll be listening to statements from our panelists and the key findings of the Adaptation Gap Report, after which we'll have about half an hour allocated for Q&A. You'll see a Q&A option on your Zoom screen. Please submit your questions in writing through that avenue, and you can start right away as soon as the speakers begin, if you have questions already prepared, having read the report or the executive summary. Now, when you submit the questions, please specify your name and the name of your media house. And just one final note, this session is being recorded, so please feel free to ask for the recording following the event. I'll go ahead now and pass it over to Musonda Mumba, our moderator.
Thank you very much, Keisha. Members of the press, ladies and gentlemen from every part of the world, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us on this press conference launch to the Adaptation Gap Report. This report is absolutely necessary. Here we are in a pandemic world where we've been shown that both the pandemic and climate change are no respecter of political boundaries. We saw how 2020 commenced with fires in California, putting a lot of pressure on healthcare systems in Canada because of the smoke going right across. And then we also saw how this pandemic has ravaged the very fabric of our society as we know it throughout 2020. But then we have news for you. This particular gap report really provides the progress on how or where we are at in terms of adaptation. How do we build resilience to the impacts of climate change? And we have a fantastic panel of speakers who are going to really tell us all about this particular report and the outcomes of this report and the findings, particularly at this very pivotal moment in our history, in this COVID-19 world that we're living in. And the focus of the Adaptation Gap Report for 2020 is really around nature-based solutions. What does that even mean? And that will be unpacked for you. We're so grateful for all the questions that have already been sent ahead of time, and looking forward to presenting them to the speakers. So the program really is going to be as follows. We're going to have some brief remarks from principals from Inga Anderson from the United Nations Environment Program, Patricia Espinosa from the Climate Change Convention of the United Nations, Mr. Petri Talas from the Secretary General of WMO, the World Meteorological Organization. Lastly, but not the least, Patrick Verkoeyen, the CEO of the Global Center on Adaptation. So without further ado, I'd like to call on Ms. Inga Anderson, who's the Executive Director of United Nations Environment Program, for your remarks, please.
Thank you very, very much, Musonda, and to the assembled press, thank you for being here. As we are launching this report, it's probably worthwhile to recall that 2020 was, in addition to COVID-19, the year of intensifying climate impacts. Floods, droughts, storms affected some 50 million people, while, as Musonda referenced, wildfires devastated forests and communities. And these impacts will only worsen. As UNEP's emissions gap report illustrated in 2020, we're not doing enough to cut greenhouse gas emissions, and that continues to be a high priority too. Based on the Paris Agreement commitments, the world is heading for at least a 3-degree centigrade rise this century. Even if we limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, and even if we hit 1.5, developing countries will suffer. This is clear. And it is also clear that it is the poorest and the most vulnerable on whom these impacts will be most pronounced. The only way to minimize these costs and damages is to race to adapt. While we do not leave aside mitigation, let me be very clear. But today we're talking about adaptation. The 5th edition of the UNEP Adaptation Report finds that while we may be gathering pace, we are still losing this vital race. Almost 3/4 of countries have adopted at least one national level adaptation planning instrument, and that is good. Since 2006, multilateral funds have initiated around 400 adaptation projects in developing countries, and we like that. However, adaptation financing is around 5% of the total climate finance, or around 30 billion per year, far short of where it's needed. And it may be useful to recall that Paris Article 9, Step 4 speaks to these two funding streams being in balance. Meanwhile, an analysis of adaptation action showed that only 3% of the reported evidence show reported evidence of real reductions in climate risks. So action is also lagging on what we refer to as nature-based solutions, which can often soften the blow of climate change and bring benefits for people, for nature, and for economies. These solutions receive but a small fraction of the climate funding, and they're not strongly enough represented in the climate pledges under the Paris Agreement. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions will reduce the impacts of climate change. Nations must prioritize a green post-pandemic recovery, a green reset, updating the climate pledges to include new net zero commitments, but they must also back adaptation with financing and support to those least responsible for climate change. I very much echo the UN Secretary General's call for the global commitment to put half of all global climate finance towards adaptation ahead of COP26 next year. That would mirror the commitment made in Paris, as I mentioned. This would be a sound economic decision as well. The Global Commission on Adaptation, and Patrick McCoyan is present here with us today, in 2019 estimated that a total of $1.8 trillion in investment in adaptation measures would bring a return of 7.1 trillion in avoided costs and benefits. So the hard truth is that climate change is already upon us and growing worse. Investing in adaptation is as much a strategy to reduce poverty reduction as any other, and one that becomes even more important in this post-COVID world that we hope to arrive at, with recent estimates from the World Bank suggesting that the new poor in the COVID, in the tail of COVID, will rise. The new poor will rise to around between 119 and 124 million people. In a world which is vastly more vulnerable, it is a world that is vastly more unequal. It is a world that is vastly more insecure than anything we've perhaps ever seen. And so in that context, we cannot afford to lose the race with adaptation. Thank you very much. Musunda, back over to you.
Thank you very much, Inga. Thank you so much for highlighting those points. That 3-degree rise, wow, a very dangerous precedent. Now, I want to hand over to Patricia Espinosa. It seems like good things come in fives. This is the 5th edition of the Adaptation Gap Report, but also the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. Over to you on your thoughts around this particular report.
Thank you very much, Musonda, and I'm very pleased to join Inger, Petteri, Patrick, and all of you involved in the release of the 5th edition of the Adaptation Gap Report. As you rightly just pointed out, this release follows on the heels of the 5th anniversary of the adoption of the Paris Agreement, an opportunity to reflect on progress made towards the adaptation-related goals within it. Dear colleagues, what we understood in 2015 is now even clearer, that in our efforts to address climate change, mitigation is not enough. The climate emergency is already here and people are already suffering. It's not about giving up, it's about facing reality. Last week, the European Union's Climate Change Service reported that 2020 tied 2016 as the world's warmest year on record. The decade that just ended will go down as the planet's hottest 10-year period in history. Last week, we also learned from Munich Re, a reinsurance company, that disasters caused 210 billion in damage in 2020. To put that number into context, that is approximately half of Germany's total spending in its planned budget for 2021. These changes are taking place with an estimated rise of only 1 degree centigrade with respect to pre-industrial age. UNEP's emissions gap report tell us that based on current pledges under the Paris Agreement, the world is headed for a 3-degree rise, as Inger has just pointed out. That's why adaptation was a key pillar of the Paris Agreement and why it remains crucial today. As we recall, the Paris Agreement requires all signatories to plan and implement adaptation measures through national adaptation plans, monitoring of climate change effects, and investing in a green future. This report shows, however, that nations still have far to go to fulfill those commitments. While they have made some progress in planning and implementation, significant gaps remain, especially enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change. It is encouraging to note that nations are working hard to develop climate change adaptation plans. 72% of all signatories to the Paris Agreement have adopted at least one national level adaptation planning instrument. Close to 10% are in the process of developing one. We also see that most developing countries are in the process of formulating and implementing a national adaptation plan. This shows how valuable the NAP process is for putting countries on a path to building medium and long-term resilience, and why it is important to continue supporting that process. Indeed, 125 out of 154 developing countries have already initiated this process. And as of last November, 55 of them are being supported along this path by the Green Climate Fund. Like many other issues in the climate change arena, however, the issue of finance remains a significant obstacle. The report shows that despite an increase in the finance available for adaptation, the adaptation finance gap is not yet closing. And despite the adaptation action we are seeing, the evidence of climate risk reduction remains inconclusive. Colleagues, despite some progress, this report shows that with respect to building adaptation and resilience against climate change, it's like we're going into battle blindfolded with one arm tied behind our backs. This is not how we achieve success. Instead, the report should illuminate the path ahead. It helps highlight the areas where more work is needed and underlines the fact that the Paris Agreement is our blueprint for long-term success. Progress is urgently needed. Less than 10 months remain until COP26. Our work to that point will be instrumental for all countries to raise adaptation ambition. This includes working together to forge ahead towards the global goal on adaptation, continue to formulate and implement national adaptation plans, and ensuring that vulnerable countries are supported in addressing loss and damage due to climate change. I thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you so very much, Patricia. Going into battle blindfolded with one hand behind, we cannot afford that. Let's work together and let's move forward together and to really resolve some of the challenges that have just been outlined. The next speaker is the Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization. Petri Kallas, over to you for your remarks, please.
Thank you, and thanks, Inger, for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to see also colleagues Patricia and Patrick behind the screen. So we have published a couple of status of climate reports before Christmas, and we are just today publishing the status of last year's climate together with the NOAA and NASA. And we have shown that we have already seen 1.2 degree warming so far, and the last year wasn't the warmest year on record because of fairly strong La Nina, which was cooling especially the Pacific region. Without that, La Nina last year would have been the warmest year on record. So far, we have seen warmest year being 2016, when we had El Nino, which was boosting the temperatures. But without this El Nino, La Nina variability, last year would clearly have been the warmest year on record. And in our report before Christmas, we also stated that there's 24% probability to reach the low limit of Paris Agreement 1.5 during the coming 5 years, so at least for 1 year. So that's demonstrating that we are very close to this low limit of Paris Agreement. We have already far exceeded 410 ppm of carbon dioxide, and 400 ppm was regarded as a critical limit, which we had last time 3 million years ago, and then the sea level was 10 to 30 meters higher than today, and the temperatures were about 2 to 4 degrees warmer than today. Last year we recorded the maximum amount of hurricanes ever. We didn't see too many category 4 and 5 hurricanes, but the amount of hurricanes in the Caribbean was highest ever. And we have seen warming of the oceans, and last year we broke the record in the heat content of oceans, and also we also broke the record in melting of glaciers. So these are all bad news. And since we know that this negative trend in climate will continue until 2060s, there's also a very high need to adapt to climate change, besides, of course, very critical mitigation. And the ability of countries to adapt to climate change, it really varies. For example, when Hurricane Harvey was hitting Texas and Houston, there were early warnings 1 week ahead, and USA was evacuating the people. But when Cyclone Idai was hitting Mozambique 2 years ago, the forecast was right, but the authorities didn't understand the impact of these numbers, and there were no means to evacuate a large amount of people, and that's why we got thousands of casualties and also much wider economic losses than without, as compared to the US case. So it's important to pay attention to early warning services, and that's very powerful way to adapt to climate change. We have to improve the observing systems, and we also have to pay attention to water resource management, because the impacts of climate change, they're very much felt through water, drought and flooding events. And we have to educate our less developed country members to deal with these multi-hazard early warnings, and especially impact-based warnings. Adaptation is very important, and these nature-based solutions, as was stated in the report, they are one important component there. But when it comes to mitigation, there the key issue is to touch the fossil energy use. With the nature-based solutions, we can do positive things, but the core remains the use of fossil energy, coal, oil, and gas. And at the moment, this mitigation situation looks fairly promising. We have 2/3 of the world's emissions under commitment of 2050-2060 carbon neutrality once the new US administration starts. So that's very promising, and we have very promising start to the race against climate change. But what finally matters is what's happening in the real atmosphere, and so far we haven't seen positive changes in the real atmosphere, and this negative trend, as I already said, will continue until 2060s, and that's why it's very important to pay also very much attention to climate adaptation. With these words, thanks for the opportunity to address you, and back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petteri. Wow. The power of early warning systems and why they matter, and the complementarity to nature-based solutions. Those eyes in the atmosphere, the satellites that bring us the pictures of the very home, the very place we call home, planet Earth. So important so that we understand the science. I now pass over to Patrick Foykozen, who is the CEO of the Global Center on Adaptation, based in Rotterdam. Over to you, please, Patrick.
Well, thank you so much, Musonda, and also congratulations, Inge, for this very important work and report which you published today. I also would like to thank Patricia, Patera, and yourself, Inge, for being part of the Global Commission on Adaptation, which you referenced in your opening remarks, and making the economic case over and above the moral case to invest in climate adaptation. Indeed, I think as the three speakers have said, that COVID-19 obviously has ushered us in an era of multiple interconnected systemic shocks. And we believe one of the casualties of this is climate adaptation. And I think we need to make up for lost ground by accelerating our action on climate adaptation and resilience. And as we heard today, I mean, COVID-19, in our view, poses both a threat and an opportunity for the climate adaptation finance agenda. I mean, the world has already forgone trillions of dollars in economic growth due to COVID last year. And as governments begin to invest these trillions of dollars of the recovery packages in the coming months, we do have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build a more resilient, climate-smart future by integrating climate adaptation in the response and recovery plans. And yet, only a fraction of COVID spending so far is going to build climate resilience. Our analysis at the GCA of domestic stimulus plans found that dirty measures, those that increase carbon emissions, outnumber green initiatives by 4-to-1. And within these green initiatives, adaptation measures themselves are even further under prioritized. As Inge said at the outset, it is clear developing countries face an increasingly steep adaptation funding challenge, also in the context of COVID-19. Why? They are especially vulnerable as they bear disproportionately climate impacts. 1, 2, their fiscal space is limited. 3, credit ratings are at risk. And 4, borrowing capacity is even further constrained. The Global Commission has indicated that the governments must put climate adaptation at the heart of recovery plans. It provides this triple win for the economy, for health and climate when we invest in water and sanitation, agriculture, and as also Patricia referenced, resilient infrastructure. At the GCA, we have been working in key steps on the way forward to this climate resilient recovery, and believe the following 3 things need to happen. We first need to strengthen our understanding of climate adaptation. Pateri just referenced it. We need to have better access to climate adaptation data collection. 2, we need to strengthen planning for climate adaptation. The report, the Gap Report, showed progress in the last year, but governments must prioritize adaptation interventions in the post-COVID recovery plans. 3, we need to strengthen finance for climate adaptation. All of the previous speakers and friends have indicated this. We need more sources of finance. We need to bring the private sector more on board, and we need to climate-proof the global financial system in this regard. On Monday, January 25, you will see all of us again at the Netherlands hosted first ever Summit of Global Leaders focused exclusively on climate adaptation. We will be discussing exactly these things and charting a way forward for how we can recover better and stronger from this crisis. We will also learn more about the Global Commission's work over the last 2 years as it sunsets and it completes its work, which the GCA, which I lead, will now carry forward. We will launch our knowledge exchange platform to ensure we can continue to learn from one another and share solutions. I hope you all will be able to join you. And again, Inge, congratulations for this extremely important work. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so very much, Patrick. Great to hear about really the momentum, the shift that's really moving, and this upcoming meeting on the 25th of January, great, and all the very best with that. I now want to hand over to Patrick Nilfert, who really is going to be representing a much bigger cluster and constituency of experts and people who put this report together to give us a brief of some of the main findings of the Adaptation Gap Report. Patrick, over to you. You're muted. You need to unmute yourself, please.
Unmute myself. Here we
Brilliant.
go.
There you go.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much, Musonda, and thank you for giving me the opportunity and the privilege to present the main findings of the report today.
You're on mute.
And
Something's muted.
this report is strongly influenced by the COVID-19 pandemic. And we are going to present some preliminary results from this in this report. Then we will present the status and progress of adaptation planning, finance, and implementation. And as has been said by Inger and others, the focus of this report is nature-based solutions, because we now understand the importance, and it's recognized much more that we have to work together with nature in order to solve our climate problems, mitigation and adaptation. This is the 5th edition of the Adaptation Gap series. The first was launched in 2014. In 2016, we talked about finance. In 2017, we focused more on the methods of adaptation assessment. In 2018, the focus was on health. And this year's Adaptation Gap Report is being launched shortly after the Climate Ambition Summit and just before the Climate Adaptation Summit, as Patrick just mentioned. So it's really timely to present this report, and I'm really grateful that there's such a great recognition of the importance of adaptation. So COVID-19 will affect adaptation planning, finance, and implementation strongly. It's a bit too early for us to say how exactly that's going to be, but we can say something about early assessments of short-term effects and longer-term effects. First of all, adaptation, because of the pandemic, has fallen down the political agenda at all levels of government, and you know, there's a good reason for that. Resources for adaptation have been reallocated, and it's important to do that. At the same time, we must continue to focus on adaptation, and we can't see that at this point yet. So the longer term trajectory is that there will be lasting implications for adaptation. The economic downturn will add pressures on public finance, and there may also be changes in the priorities of governments when it comes to assessing finance and funds to do the recovery of the fallout that the pandemic has caused. And the results of this are, as in so many other instances, that vulnerable countries and population groups will be disproportionately affected by this change. As Patrick and others have mentioned, the change in financial availabilities, the constrictions here, make it more difficult, particularly for countries that are already cash-strapped and have less capacities, technical, human, and governance-related capacities to respond to the climate risks. And potentially some of the nationally determined contributions may also no longer be viable based on these changes. So there is a great opportunity to use the stimulus packages that are being prepared and presented by many countries all over the world to turn the recovery into a climate resilient and low emissions one. But unfortunately, so far, we can see that this opportunity is not being used to the degree possible. And it would be very, very important that governments at all levels, all over the world, align their recovery plans more closely to their climate adaptation and mitigation plans. At the same time, as Inger has pointed out, climate change just continues and is getting worse. As Petri also pointed out, it's been one of the warmest years on record. Millions of people affected by floods, droughts, and storms, locusts ravaging Africa, East Africa, wildfires in Australia, Brazil, Russia, and USA. And therefore, it's much more important, it's more important than ever that we make progress on adaptation. And the following results will talk to that. I do need to give a bit of background on what adaptation to climate change means. Because it's a process that helps us adjust to climate risks and reduces the climate risks as we go forward. So,
Henry, I just have to let you know that we'll have to move on swiftly to questions shortly.
oh,
Yes, please, because we have House from the Press who'll be asking some
I thought
questions.
I had 15 minutes.
Ooh, I'm afraid we're running out of time.
Oh,
Go ahead.
so, okay, so I must really then hurry up with the presentation. If I don't have 15 minutes, then it's going to be very difficult to present everything. Anyway, without adaptation, we can see that irrespective of the levels of implementation of mitigation, the results, the damages are going to be much lower. And that is the main purpose of what we're doing in this report. And this figure shows sort of conceptually how that might look like. I'm going to skip most of this. There is a close link to mitigation. The more we mitigate, the less we have to adapt, and the costs of adaptation are going to be much, much lower. Just as a comparison, we are currently heading towards 3 degrees Celsius, and that will depress growth annually by 1.5 to 2.2%. But if we reach 2 degrees, and we're trying to get below that, it would be about half of the growth depression. That's a major change. And again, most developing countries will be hit hardest and worst. The report looks at planning, finance, and implementation, and over 70% of countries have now adopted at least one national adaptation planning instrument. That's strategies, plans, policies, or laws. 9% are in the process of doing so, and then most developing countries are developing national adaptation plans. And there's also an increase in sectoral and subnational planning instruments coming forward. So these are all positive signs. What we don't know yet is there is a difference in the quality of the instruments being used. About half of the countries address climate change comprehensively in their plans, rather than focusing only on 1 or 2 sectors. There is greater inclusiveness with the stakeholders involved and dedicated processes in place. There's also some horizontal integration taking place, that is across sectors, but we can see that vertical integration, for instance, is not so good across governance levels. Also, the levels of implementation, the administration, regulatory instruments incentives and funding are not good. And then, of course, monitoring and evaluation are also in need of improvement. So we can see that there are differences in the quality of adaptation planning.
Mm-hmm.
Adaptation finance, we can see that the costs are currently at around, estimated at 70 billion per year, and they will rise to 140 to 300 billion by 2030, or 280 to 500 billion by 2050. But as Patrick also mentioned, if we invest 1.8 trillion in adaptation measures, we will get a dividend of 7.1, that's nearly 1 to 4 in avoided costs and social and environmental benefits. So that's an enormous incentive to invest in adaptation. Adaptation finance is just 30 billion per year. That's just 5% of total climate finance. It has been growing over the past years, but percentage-wise, it still remains at just 5% over the last 5 years. And based on the comparison between costs and finance flows, it's difficult to make this comparison. We can still say that it's potentially the gap is widening, at least it's not closing.
Great.
And countries are investing more in a more sustainable financial system and using new instruments to bring in private sector investments. And this must continue, and to avoid that the investments continue in investments that are increase climate vulnerability. So this is very important for the future of climate finance and the climate finance systems.
Great.
Yes.
Henry, in the interest of time, I'll just mention to the people from the press that we're going to share with them this presentation, because we have to move on fairly quickly now to the questions, if that's okay.
I will just, if you let me just talk a little bit about implementation and at least one slide.
Just one more slide, please. Just one more slide, please, because we've really run out of time and it's almost up to the hour now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Just one more slide, please.
So implementation of climate projects, we've assessed that to the degree possible, and it is also growing. We can say that it's still in early days to say what the results of these investments are going to be, but we can see that there is progress being made in that area as well. And just one final slide on nature-based solutions. Here we see that also, as in planning, finance, and implementation, we are making progress. There is an increase, clearly detectable, and at the same time, the financial investments are very small, very low. Implementation is still in an early stage, and we cannot exactly say yet what the results of climate risk reduction are going to be in the end. Thank you. I stop here.
No, thank you so much, Henry. Apologies for having to cut you short. I'll now move very quickly to the Q&A. We've got some questions. The first question comes from Goya. Goya Forster, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name correctly, from the German press agency. And this question is for Inga. Climate shocks will hit developing countries much harder than developed countries, even though the latter are far bigger contributors of CO2 emissions. Do you feel developing countries have a responsibility to help developed countries in their adaptation to climate change and climate shocks? To what extent have they done this already, and how much more do they need to do? Over to you, Inga.
As I understand it, the question is, do developed countries have a responsibility to developing countries in terms of finance? Absolutely. That's the very essence of the Paris Agreement. And that's the very essence of Article 9, paragraph 4, which speaks to these two funding sources being in balance. Now, we need to understand, obviously, that mitigation matters, and at times it has a higher degree of cost. But so we shouldn't make these two enemies of one another. What we need is to meet the commitment that was made back in COP15 at $100 billion per year by 2020. That's where we need to be at. Now, what is really good is that we are seeing an increase in towards adaptation, and so we want to mark the good, but we also want to be mindful that we're not at all, which is what this report highlights, where we need to be. And so the COVID recovery, as was highlighted by everyone on this panel, and as we can say till we are frankly blue in the face, never before has so much public funds, because let's recall, these are not monies that are lying around in treasuries just waiting to be put into something. These are monies we are borrowing from the next generation in all likelihoods. We are taking this money, and rightly so, putting it to health first and foremost, putting it into people's pockets. I get that. But thereafter, when we begin to put money into the economy, into industry, into infrastructure, hang on a minute. Let's be sure we don't just put it into gray infrastructure. Let's be sure that we make, when we want to make work schemes, etc., that we put it into adaptation and ecosystem-based adaptation, nature-based solutions type opportunities. And we're seeing that in places, but not enough. And we will probably not have a situation like the one we have right now, where we're seeing that amount of money going into the economy. Let's not miss this chance. That's the bottom line. And so, yes, there is an obligation in the convention, in the Paris Agreement itself, but there is also a moral obligation, obviously, to pay and frankly, a self-interest obligation, because when one has climate change, we all have climate change, and there is no vaccine for climate change. So we better get on with it and pay attention to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Inga. There is no vaccine for climate change. I think this question is directed to Petri. Meha from India, Meha Sharma, Lockett Group, is asking, India this year has seen extreme winters in the northern areas, whereas no or little winter at all in other parts of the country. This extreme change in climate is alarming. Where are the climate scenarios heading for Southeast Asian countries? If you can give us some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I could mention a few things. First of all, we expect that this melting of the glaciers is continuing, and that means that you will get less water to the major rivers, both in India and China, for example. I think that's one of the key things. And then we have seen warming of the oceans, and that's giving more energy for the tropical storms, and you can expect to see more often higher categories tropical storms hitting your country. And then Southern Asia is an area which is supposed to suffer because of drought much more in the future. So there are various factors affecting you, and that should stimulate also the government of India to act, and you are having the worst equality challenges worldwide, and you could mitigate climate and mitigate the equality problem by changing your energy systems and transport systems to become more less dependent on fossil energy. So that's what I would like to recommend to India.
Thank you so very much for that recommendation, Petri. This question goes to both Patricia and Patrick. Perhaps we'll start with you, Patricia. The question is coming from Megan Rowling, who's from the Thomson Reuters Foundation. She asks, we have a very clear yardstick to measure mitigation efforts, net zero emissions by 2050. What, in your view, can be the equivalent for adaptation? Without a clear long-term goal, can the adaptation gap really be closed? In time to avoid catastrophic impacts and galvanize enough funding? Patricia? Okay, there you go.
Yes, I was not sure whether I was muted or not. Thank you for that question, because it gives me the opportunity to talk about the national adaptation plans, the NAPs, which are embedded in the Paris Agreement, in the decisions by the conference. So what we should have is really an acceleration of countries coming forward with national adaptation plans that will allow every country to have really an integrated strategy. The point about adaptation is that it covers so many different aspects of society and the economy that efforts are frequently dispersed. So the integrating all these different aspects in a good comprehensive plan is absolutely necessary to be able to have the big impact that we require in order to, because adaptation, we're talking about safety of people, food security, we're talking about really very essential, the very essential needs of people. So yes, we do have the national adaptation plans. We are seeing, as I was mentioning in my remarks, we are seeing that many countries are in the process of preparing their national adaptation plans, but so far we still have too few. We have around 25 plans that have been presented so far. There's really a long way to go. It is not an easy task to put together a national adaptation plan. There's a lot of work, technical work to be done, and in some countries, capacity to do that is lacking. So those efforts, even the support for the formulation of the plans, is absolutely needed. Now, once we have the plans, we also need to ensure the means and the support in order to have them implemented. So we do have this instrument. I think that the objectives of each plan has to be, of course, adapted to the circumstances of every country.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Your thoughts, Patrick, on that question?
Well, thank you so much. And also thank you, Megan, for this very important question indeed. Let me just try to build on Patricia. In my sort of statement, I referenced this need for strengthening the understanding of climate adaptation, indeed referencing how to measure progress. And as Megan, as you said, with the exception of financial outlays, measuring progress on climate adaptation is in fact, it's complicated. We have a clear metrics for mitigation. Climate adaptation has many variables, right? So measuring the impact of adaptation remains work in progress. We need, to answer your question straight on, we need to develop a universally agreed set of metrics for adaptation to be able to track the effectiveness of adaptation outcomes over time. I mean, and these metrics, once defined, will also allow then for a better understanding of progress by state and non-state actors.
And this next question actually is for you, Patrick, from Carl Mitterson, who's from Politico. Are there any mechanisms beyond the existing ones that show most promise for actually delivering adaptation financing at scale required?
So I think there is not one mechanism which is sort of the trick where everything should be our hope on. Given the scale of the financial challenge, I think we need to bring in all sources of finance on board, whether it's from the MDBs or bilaterals or the private sector, or developing new instruments such as what is currently on the development, adaptation, resilience bonds. I think where we are today, I think Inga said it in her opening statement on finance. Yes, there is some progress, but I mean, it's not moving fast enough on 30 billion a year compared to the 300 billion a year where we need to be by 2030. So we need to bring in all sources to the table. All instruments need to be utilized to really drive the climate finance agenda. And I think the actor group which really needs to be incentivized and to step up is the private sector. We need much more private sector finance into the space of adaptation and resilience building.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Inga, I'm coming back to you with a question from the New York Times from Ruth McLean. She's wondering, you spoke about Africa leapfrogging, polluting energy sources right into renewables. What evidence do you have that this is happening around the continent, and what can be done to encourage it?
I think, thank you very much, Musunda. What the reporter is referring to is other statements that I've made in the press. And this is this opportunity that exists where, if you like, the carbon intensive footprint in the infrastructure, in the energy infrastructure has not yet gone down, i.e. where you do not, and we can regret that, have 100% access to energy, that in fact, there we have an opportunity to leapfrog and not go through what I refer to often as a polluting age, right? And take and grab new technologies. And just to mention that under the Climate Change Convention, there is a technology dimension to it, and we at UNEP are proud to host that mechanism, and the sister mechanism to the Green Climate Fund that everybody knows. Fewer know about the technology mechanism. Examples, as was asked, well, UNEP is based in Kenya, so I will start in Kenya, which is our proud home. And there it's worthwhile noticing that 70% of Kenya's electric energy is renewable. And why is that? That is because the country over the last 15 years have been making a very determined effort to, because they did not have 100% access. They were in the 20s percentage of access points when they started this investment scheme, but they've gone for for geothermal, significantly since they sit on the rift. They've gone for wind as well as for on-roof, off-grid solar, and had a massive success. I could mention Morocco in the other end of the continent, $9 billion invested, Noor 1, Noor 2, Noor 3 in the Ouarzazate area, solar, concentrated solar, as well as solar thermal. I could mention South Africa, and I could go on and on. The point here is that and then of course you have hydro, which has environmental dimensions of which we always want to manage, but nevertheless also offers a renewable alternative. So there are real alternatives. And this is where climate finance also needs to come. Now, today's conversation is about adaptation, but we need to understand that where we don't have a full energy supply at 100% of access, that gap, the energy gap, needs to be met by renewable resources. And that is where climate finance can come in, and where good leadership and good policies, feed-in tariffs, et cetera, can really enable that. And we are seeing some really good examples on the continent. Thank you.
Great. No, that's fantastic. Good leadership going ahead. Henry, this is a question for you from Malaika Viawahare, who's from Mongo Bay. And she's wondering, the report says that the annual financing for adaptation is 30 billion annually. How does it measure up to what we actually need? What is the shortfall? And can you also provide an example of a nature-based solution that has shown to work for climate change adaptation measure, if that's possible?
Thank you. Yeah, 30 billion is certainly too low, and it's only 5% of the total climate finance. At the same time, we don't know exactly how much adaptation finance is needed because the goals are not clear, the targets are not clear. There is no agreed upon goal on adaptation at national and global levels. So without setting those goals, it's very difficult to assess exactly how much finance is going to be needed. Based on the costs that we know today, we can say that there is a significant mismatch and that we need to step up the funding that is available, that is going towards adaptation. That is clear. Currently, if we say we have 70 billion impacts of climate change already, definitely we would need to at least double the finance flows in the very short term. And if these costs are going to rise in the next 10 years by 2 to 3 times the values we have today, then we can see that the climate finance investments need to be stepped up dramatically. And in terms of nature-based solutions, how they are effective, floodplains, for instance, can better manage flooding than many other interventions that we can do. It's a way to reduce the flow of surface water that flows into the rivers and then affects, for instance, urban areas. Heat island effects can be very effectively mitigated through urban spaces, green spaces, blue spaces in urban areas. And, I could go on. There are many, many ways through which nature-based solutions affect and
Yeah.
effective.
No, thank you so much, Henry. Ladies and gentlemen of the press and the general public, I must say we're running out of time. This has been so fantastic. So many questions have come in, and we will respond to each and every question. Thank you so much for listening in. I just want to now wrap up and say thank you for listening into the conversations from this report that was spearheaded and led by UNEP. Thank you so much to Patricia from the UNFCCC, to you, Patrick, and also from Petri. We sincerely thank you for joining on this launch. The report is now unembargoed, and you can read the full outcomes of that. And the emails are there for you to just send us any questions that you may have with our news desk. We're all ready to respond to you within the wider community. Thank you very much, and have a lovely day, rest of the day, and be safe. Bye-bye.